Hey everybody, Johnny the Queer POTUS here, and today I'm going to be doing something a little bit different than what I normally do. I'd like to talk about the recently deceased former Secretary of State, Colin Powell. You can see here Al-Jazeera has run an article about Colin Powell. Stop being polite, Colin Powell was a killer. On the other hand, we have the Washington Post here, Colin Powell, the reluctant warrior. Those are kind of the two different sides of Colin Powell that we're hearing about today in the aftermath of his death. And I just decided to go in and learn as much about Colin Powell as I possibly could in the last couple of days. And I came up with some interesting stuff, and I thought maybe I could sort of explain who he was and what his influence on United States military and United States foreign policy actually was.
The education process begins.
So, who was Colin Powell? Well, we're going to start with his service in Vietnam, because this will be a kind of a military biography of him. So he fights in the Vietnam War as a captain. He experiences quite a bit of combat on the Laos side of the border with Vietnam. During one of his expeditions, during his first tours, he steps on a spike. It was poisoned, and so he injured his foot. And for that, he received the Purple Heart and the Bronze Star. Then on his second tour to Vietnam, he was involved in a helicopter crash. He dragged one of the superior officers out of the burning helicopter, and for that he received a Legion of Merit. Because he fought in Vietnam, he became over time very suspicious of politicians, of bureaucrats. And so what he came to believe was that the United States military had to play a stronger role in conducting military operations. We have to keep the politicians kind of out of this, because the military can go in, it can do the job, and it can minimize harm to the people that we're making war against by conducting war effectively. Now, beyond Colin Powell's battlefield skills, he had another skill set, and that was he was very social. He was very good at making friends and connections. When he was living in Washington, D.C., I read one story about him playing racquetball with a Saudi prince who ended up becoming the Saudi ambassador during the Gulf War. So Colin Powell was chairman of the Joint Chiefs at the time. The U.S. put a lot of its troops in Saudi Arabia and launched the invasion from Saudi Arabia. So they were the most important ally we had during the Gulf War. And this guy was playing racquetball with Colin Powell at one point. So he's good at making connections with powerful people. He was good at administrative tasks as well. He was also good at keeping secrets. He wrote the report of the My Lai massacre in Vietnam, which was one of the worst massacres in the war. And many historians consider his report whitewashed. And he also gave several testimonies that minimized what had happened at My Lai. So how Colin Powell went from being a military man to a political man, it's a transformation that takes place during the Reagan administration. So when Ronald Reagan's elected president, he chooses Caspar Weinberger as his Secretary of Defense. And Powell is actually assigned to give him a tour of the White House. Powell knew Weinberger already. They had developed a friendship, I believe, during the Ford administration. And so Weinberger starts to use him as an advisor. And Powell's advice soon becomes very valued within the Reagan administration. Many people in Reagan's cabinet are seeking advice from Powell. And then the Iran-Contra scandal hits. It's revealed that President Reagan and his administration have illegally sold weapons to Iranians and used the money to fund the Contras in Nicaragua, which the Congress had just passed a law saying you couldn't do. Reagan was in a lot of trouble. The Congress was talking about impeaching him. And there were all these hearings. And during those hearings, there was a congressman from Wyoming named Dick Cheney, who thought that Reagan had been unfairly called to account because realistically, if the president of the United States conducts the American foreign policy, he should have maximum latitude to do things, including unethical things, in the pursuit of American interests. And so Cheney starts to develop this idea that Congress has taken too much power away from the president, especially with regards to foreign affairs. And so he's going to make it his mission in life to return power to the executive branch. Cheney and Powell, they become friends during the Reagan administration, and Cheney comes to really respect Powell. They both agree that the United States military should be larger than it is. And during the Reagan years, Ronald Reagan does increase the military budget dramatically. And so both Powell and Cheney are very happy under President Reagan. But once the Iran-Contra scandal hits, President Reagan has to fire a bunch of people. So there's this huge cabinet shakeup. And in the shakeup, Colin Powell rises to Deputy National Security Advisor and then eventually becomes the national security advisor for President Reagan. Now, Powell helps to sort of guide the administration through the Iran-Contra affair. Again, just like with the My Lai massacre, Powell gives testimony to defend the administration. Reagan gets very close to a possible impeachment trial, but then he sort of saves his presidency at the very end. Gorbachev in the USSR has been gradually sort of opening things up in Russia at the urging of the United States and the United Kingdom. People are really excited about Russia potentially becoming a capitalist democracy instead of a communist country. And Reagan is looking like the world peacemaker at this time. So at the end of the Reagan presidency, his vice president, George Herbert Walker Bush, runs in 1988. He wins, becomes the 41st president of the United States. Dick Cheney becomes the Secretary of Defense, and he pleads with President Bush, nominate Colin Powell to be the chairman of the Joint Chiefs. President Bush thinks that Powell is not quite ready for it yet, but ultimately Cheney lobbies extremely hard, and Bush decides to nominate Colin Powell for chairman of the Joint Chiefs, and he becomes chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. He becomes chairman of the Joint Chiefs at a very interesting moment in American history. There was a law that had been passed in 1985 called the Goldwater Nichols Act, and it placed more power in the hands of the chairman of the Joint Chiefs than had ever been placed before. So before, you have the Joint Chiefs. You have a series of different people who represent the different branches of the military who interact with the civilian government in order to implement military policy correctly. But as the United States was becoming a bigger power and was spreading all over the world, it needed to be able to make decisions faster. And so it could not rely on the Joint Chiefs to have to approve every action. So they decided to consolidate all the power to the chairman of the Joint Chiefs. So he's really the first very, very extremely powerful chairman of the Joint Chiefs. It's a position that you probably would not have thought too much about before Colin Powell. Colin Powell turns the position into a really political one and into a really visible one. He does press conferences very often where he jokes and kind of laughs it up with the audience and displays his charm.
Clearly not the American press for this one.
Now, in addition to having a lot of power as chairman of Joint Chiefs, Powell also brings to the table a fixed military philosophy called the Powell Doctrine. And the Powell Doctrine essentially argued for massive, overwhelming force, quick, in, boom, 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 and out as soon as you possibly can get out. And at the very base of this Powell Doctrine is the fear of a repeat of what happened in Vietnam, a situation where the United States foolishly bogs itself down in a quagmire. This situation can be avoided if the United States has such a huge military, so we have to increase spending on military, that it can go in with overwhelming force, do whatever it has to do in the country, and leave. And the country will still be mostly intact because we didn't blow everything up. We left an infrastructure for the new government there to use. Powell gets two opportunities in the Bush administration to test out the Powell Doctrine. And the first is an overwhelming success from the point of view of the U.S. military and from Powell's point of view, and that'll be Panama. So in 1989, the first year of the Bush administration, there's this fella named Noriega. He is a right-wing leader of Nicaragua. His chief function is to suppress radicals and communists and even just basic working class people who disagree with the regime in any way. And also he facilitates a very profitable drug trade throughout the Caribbean that helps to support his regime. So President Bush, Mr. Just Say No, he's like, we gotta take him out.
At this moment, U.S. forces are engaged in action in Panama. The United States intends to withdraw the forces newly deployed to Panama as quickly as possible.
So Operation Just Cause happens on December 20th, 1989. Powell sends 27,000 U.S. troops to this tiny little Panama. It's the largest overseas deployment since Vietnam, and it is over very quickly. I mean, it takes, I think, a few days or a week, but it's pretty fast. And it seems to prove that the Powell Doctrine is the way of the future. Now, the second opportunity that Powell has to try out his doctrine will be the Gulf War. So in 1991, Saddam Hussein attacked his oil-rich neighbor, Kuwait, to the south, and annexed it to Iraq. This was an untenable situation for the United States and for a lot of countries in the international community because they did not want Saddam Hussein to be in control of 20% of the world's oil resources. Powell is reticent about going into Iraq. He's very happy to use the Powell Doctrine in the Western Hemisphere, but going out to the Middle East is going to require a lot more material. It's going to require more alliances. And so Powell is arguing for the administration to make sure that everything passes diplomatic muster if they do actually go in. The war lasts a couple of months. It's an overwhelming victory for the United States.
Aggression is defeated. The war is over. Desert Storm's success belongs to the team that so ably leads our armed forces, our Secretary of Defense and our Chairman of the Joint Chiefs, Dick Cheney and Colin Powell.
Powell and Secretary of Defense Dick Cheney become the heroes of the moment. There's a huge parade at one point where they're paraded around the street. This is the point in time when the idea that Colin Powell might run for president starts to get floated around, which brings up the eternal question that people always ask about Colin Powell: why didn't he run for president? And there were a lot of different reasons. He was worried about getting criticized. He was a thin-skinned guy, apparently. The rigors of a presidential campaign did not appeal to him. He had enough power as it is, didn't need to necessarily be president of the United States. He had a lot of influence on American government from where he already was. But perhaps one of the biggest reasons is that politically he did not fit into any particular party. He was very fiscally conservative, especially against the capital gains tax. He was constantly talking about getting the government off our backs, very grassroots, sort of pull yourself up by your bootstraps type of philosophy. But socially, he was liberal. He was pro-choice, pro-immigrant, pro-affirmative action, pro-same-sex marriage. In fact, in 1996, at the Republican National Convention, when Colin Powell was giving a speech, he mentioned that he was pro-choice, and it garnered some boos in the audience.
You all know that I believe in a woman's right to choose, and I strongly support affirmative action. And I was invited.
So you can see that Colin Powell was not exactly perfectly lined up with the Republican Party, and he was often sought out by presidential candidates as somebody whose endorsement could help them become president. And the first person to benefit from this would be George W. Bush. George W. Bush offered Colin Powell the position of Secretary of State. Secretaries of State are often very powerful in administrations, and he's extremely happy about this. Not only that, but his old friend Dick Cheney is coming along as vice president, and that should make everything great. But you remember how I told you that Dick Cheney had a mission in life to sort of change the presidency and take power away from the Congress? Once he's in the vice presidency, Cheney starts to set up his own sort of alternate presidency. He becomes President Bush's top advisor. So he's sort of the favorite at court, the guy that President Bush is constantly leaning towards. In fact, Bush had chosen Cheney in particular because he had a lot more experience than Bush did. And so he thought he could rely on Cheney to sort of guide him through his first term and help him become a competent president. But he ended up becoming sort of his puppet. And the reason Cheney was able to do that is that he built his own power base within the administration. He was able to get Donald Rumsfeld, which was his oldest friend, and who he served with in many administrations, including the Gerald Ford administration, to get him as Secretary of Defense. This basically shored up the Cheney wing. And these were the hawks, the neocons, the people who were out for blood. Powell and Condoleezza Rice, the National Security Advisor, their opinions were often very sidelined. So during the administration, while Powell is out around the world sort of conducting America's diplomacy, Cheney is back at the White House directing policy and building his power base. Kind of like how Stalin stayed in the Kremlin all the time and the other Bolsheviks went out here and there around the country, and Stalin ended up building his power base. It's really interesting that Cheney and Stalin are similar in that way. Now, you might be wondering if Colin Powell and Condoleezza Rice are one side of the equation and Donald Rumsfeld and Cheney are the other side of the equation, with Rice and Powell being the doves, and Rumsfeld and Cheney being the hawks, why did the hawks always get their way? Well, one answer to that is, of course, 9/11. And the other is that there was a third member of the hawk group, and that was the president himself. George W. Bush was extremely committed to the very same project that Cheney was committed to. And discussions about attacking Iraq started out in the cabinet very early, even before 9/11, but they were exacerbated after the 9/11 attacks. So George W. Bush himself is far more sympathetic to the advice he's getting from Cheney and Rumsfeld, and is not using a lot of the advice he's getting from Powell and Condoleezza Rice. So this is the balance of power in the Bush administration on the eve of the biggest attack on American soil in a long, long, long time.
This act will not stand. We will find those who did it. We will smoke them out of their holes. We will get them running, and we'll bring them to justice.
Thank you, Mr. President. I might just say that I'm very pleased with the response we've been getting from the international community.
9/11 turns out to be an open door for Cheney and his mission to return war-making powers to the presidency. George Bush gets unprecedented war-making powers. And as Colin Powell is traveling around the world conducting America's diplomacy, Cheney is back home influencing policy and even making decisions outside of the cabinet. He actually gets George Bush to sign a torture memo at one point while they're sitting down at breakfast. And Powell was out traveling in Asia at the time. Now, this can lead to a view that Colin Powell was fighting the good fight against things like torture and illegal renditions, illegal detention that the United States has conducted, removal of the Geneva Convention standards. And yes, he did rhetorically fight against these things in cabinet meetings with the president, but he ultimately went with the administration policy. He did not criticize it in public, although he may have engaged in some leaks that sort of tried to help the press discover what was going on in the Bush administration. But ultimately, he kept quiet on a lot of this stuff. And he was at the meetings where torture was discussed and things like that. So he knew about that. By all accounts, the Bush administration began talking about going to war with Iraq even before 9/11 happened. But after 9/11, talk of going to war in Iraq really exploded. The Bush administration saw 9/11 as the beginning of a global war, and the enemy was terrorism, which is a tactic, not a nation state. This presented a new problem for the Powell Doctrine in particular, because it was meant to be applied in nation states. You go in, you knock the bad government out, you put the good government in, you leave mostly everything intact, everything's fine, right? And so this is the mentality that Powell is going to be bringing to the war on terror, and it's not really going to work for the war on terror. Now, once Colin Powell came to the conclusion that no matter what he said or did, the administration was going to go to the war with Iraq, he went with it and he supported it. He refused to criticize it in public. And then, of course, he famously went to the UN and made the case for weapons of mass destruction.
Indeed, the facts and Iraq's behavior show that Saddam Hussein and his regime are concealing their efforts to produce more weapons of mass destruction. And unless we act, we are confronting an even more frightening future.
What's interesting is that in my readings of Colin Powell throughout his life, he was aware of this whole weapons of mass destruction stuff. He heard Cheney talking about it many times. And there are multiple quotes of Colin Powell sort of saying, weapons of mass destruction are stupid. Why would a country want to pursue them? It's just suicide for them. It seems very clear that Colin Powell did not believe there was weapons of mass destruction, or at least an imminent threat that required military action. But he was a loyal soldier. He was, and you can call him a war criminal for it, but that's the way he thinks. He's like, I'm going to support the administration, minimize damage. Unfortunately for Colin Powell, not only do weapons of mass destruction not get found, but a few other key decisions are made after the attack in Iraq that Colin Powell has absolutely no influence over, including one decision that Colin Powell, as Secretary of State, should have had a lot of influence over, which was the decision to put Paul Bremer in as the ambassador to Iraq after Saddam fell. And the decision to disband the Iraqi police, the Iraqi army, this is going completely against the Powell Doctrine at this point, right? You're not leaving the new government and infrastructure to rebuild the country. And so when the government that the United States tried to prop up in Iraq took over, there was really nothing to work with except a bunch of very disgruntled and angry and recently fired military people who had a bone to pick with the United States. And our American troops and the civilians of Iraq were the ones who felt the brunt of that huge mistake. So Powell ultimately, at the end of 4 years, has had enough, and he decides to resign. He was led to believe that he would not be the only one to resign. They thought that Rumsfeld would resign too, but Rumsfeld did not resign. Nobody resigned but Powell. And so he was very, very angry when he resigned. Felt like he'd been swindled. It's kind of like the Montreal screw job or something. So for the rest of Colin Powell's life, he became a critical voice in the media, a voice that often criticized U.S. military policy and a critic of U.S. interventionism. He openly criticized Bush's decision in 2007 to surge more troops into Iraq. He supported Barack Obama over John McCain, who was a good friend of his, because he believed that growing anti-Muslim, pro-nativist sentiments in the Republican Party were tarnishing the party of Lincoln, which accepts a big tent.
I became a Republican because I want to help fill the big tent that our party has raised to attract all Americans.
There is not a liberal America and a conservative America. There is the United States of America.
My parents came to this country as immigrants over 70 years ago.
My parents shared not only an improbable love, they shared an abiding faith in the possibilities of this nation.
They came here, as had millions of others, with nothing but hope, a willingness to work hard, and a desire to use the opportunities given them by their new land.
The audacity of hope. The hope of a skinny kid with a funny name who believes that America has a place for him too.
He endorsed Barack Obama, supported the Iran nuclear deal, and he even criticized Obama many times for his more hawkish policies, including the decision to overthrow Gaddafi in Libya, and he urged President Obama to hold back on Syria as well. He hated President Trump for his disparaging comments about the military, supposedly, for his disparaging comments about NATO, for saying NATO was obsolete. Powell was very much a believer in alliances. It was actually his biggest disagreement with Cheney, because Cheney thought alliances are for the Cold War. The Cold War ended. Those alliances are obsolete now. America has to act on its own, or nobody else is going to do it. So stop talking to me about alliances. He also hated Trump for January 6th and for the way he conducted himself during the election. He supported Hillary Clinton in 2016 and supported Joe Biden in 2020, and was very vocally supportive of Biden's decision to remove troops from Afghanistan, which was a war that he helped to start as well, a 20-year war. So there you have it. Colin Powell. Is he the reluctant warrior or the butcher? I think he's both. He believed that he had some important role to play in restraining administrations from their most hawkish excesses, but ultimately he served as a legitimizer. He legitimized George Bush when he endorsed him, and his presentation at the UN made a lot of people who were skeptical of Bush go whole in for supporting the Iraq war. Later in life, perhaps out of bitterness for his experience, but perhaps out of the tugs of conscience, he became very anti-intervention and a very dovish sort of person. So how you want to judge Colin Powell for that, I'll leave up to you. The purposes of this channel is to educate, to make you think critically, and to open your mind a little bit to how history works and understand the influences of historical figures, so we can better understand why our world is the way it is today. So thanks, everybody, for listening in today to this presentation on Colin Powell, and I hope to chat with you all soon.